On the morning of March 16, 1968, an 18-year-old door gunner named Larry Colburn found himself in a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. He was sitting in a small observation helicopter in a hamlet called My Lai, his M60 machine gun in his hands, and his pilot had just given him an order that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson had landed their helicopter directly between a group of Vietnamese civilians and a squad of American soldiers who were advancing toward them with weapons ready. Thompson turned to Colburn and to their crew chief, Glenn Andreotta, and spoke very clearly. "If those American troops open fire on these people or on us, you open fire on them." Colburn swung his M60 toward the American infantrymen, standing just meters away. Andreotta did the same with his weapon on the other side. For a long, tense moment, Americans aimed at Americans while terrified Vietnamese women and children huddled nearby, waiting to see who would shoot first. There was no enemy fire that morning, no Viet Cong ambush, no firefight to speak of. What was happening in that hamlet was something far darker, and Thompson's helicopter crew had just placed themselves in the middle of it with nothing but a light observation helicopter and 2 machine guns between them and their own countrymen. It would take 30 years before anyone in the United States military officially called these 3 men heroes. To understand how they ended up pointing their weapons at fellow American soldiers to protect Vietnamese civilians, you first have to understand what their job actually was, and why helicopter door gunners were some of the most exposed and vulnerable men in the entire war. When American helicopters arrived in Vietnam in large numbers, they came as unarmed transports. The idea was to use them as flying trucks, moving soldiers and supplies across terrain that would take days to cross on foot. They were crewed by a pilot, co-pilot, and a crew chief who handled maintenance and helped with loading, and there were no weapons mounted on them at all. The military assumed that speed and air mobility would be protection enough. If you could fly over the jungle instead of hacking through it, the thinking went, the enemy couldn't touch you. That assumption turned out to be dangerously wrong. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army figured out American helicopter tactics quickly. They learned to predict flight paths and landing zones, and they began setting ambushes specifically for the thin-skinned helicopters, coming in low and slow to drop off troops. They had plenty of Soviet-supplied weapons for the job, heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons that could tear a helicopter apart from a considerable distance, not to mention RPGs that could destroy one with a single hit. Even rifle fire at close range could sever a fuel line or kill a pilot, and helicopters started going down at an alarming rate. By the end of the war, nearly half of all the helicopters deployed to Vietnam would crash, and enemy fire was one of the main reasons. So, while the brass tried to figure out a solution, the crews on the ground started improvising. Crew chiefs began strapping M60 machine guns to their helicopters, either with bungee cords or improvised mounts, and firing during approaches and takeoffs to suppress anything that might be shooting at them. This was obviously better than flying in unarmed, so the concept spread fast, but it left one side of the helicopter unprotected, so a 4th crew member was added to cover the opposite door. That became the dedicated door gunner, also called the shotgun rider. What started as field improvisation soon became official doctrine, and the door gunner became an essential part of helicopter operations. Now different helicopters had different roles. The transport Hueys, called slicks, carried troops and cargo into landing zones. Gunship Hueys carried heavy weapons and provided fire support. And then there were the smaller observation helicopters like the OH-23 Raven, which was what Hugh Thompson flew. Scout helicopter crews like Thompson's were the eyes in the sky for ground operations. They flew low and slow over the terrain, trying to draw enemy fire, marking targets with smoke grenades, and coordinating with ground troops and gunships. It was dangerous work, flying deliberately low to see what was down there and hoping you spotted the enemy before they spotted you. The door gunner and crew chief on a scout helicopter scanned constantly for movement, ready to engage targets or call in heavier firepower. On March 16, 1968, Thompson's crew was doing exactly that job, scouting ahead of a major ground assault. They expected to find Viet Cong. What they found instead was something else entirely. Hugh Thompson was 24 years old, a warrant officer from Stone Mountain, Georgia, who had joined the Army in 1966, specifically to fly. He arrived in Vietnam in late December 1967 and was assigned to fly OH-23 Raven observation helicopters with the 123rd Aviation Battalion. His door gunner was Larry Colburn, just 18 years old, who had enlisted at 17 and deployed to Vietnam that same December. The crew chief was Glenn Andreotta, 20 years old and already on his second tour. The three of them flew scout missions together, and by March 1968, they had seen enough of the war to know what combat looked like. On the morning of March 16th, they were briefed on a major operation. Intelligence claimed that a hamlet called My Lai was a stronghold of the 48th Viet Cong Local Force Battalion. The ground troops, Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion 20th Infantry, were told to expect heavy resistance and that civilians would be gone to market by the time the assault began. Anyone still in the village should be considered hostile. Thompson's job was to scout ahead of the infantry, fly low to draw any enemy fire, and mark targets for the ground troops and gunships. Thompson's helicopter lifted off around dawn and arrived over the hamlet shortly before the ground assault began. Almost immediately, the crew noticed that something was wrong. They flew low over the rice paddies and tree lines, trying to draw fire the way they always did, but nothing came up at them. There was no enemy fire at all. Instead of Viet Cong fighters, they saw civilians going about their morning, old men and women with children, some of them heading out as if to go to market. At first, the crew thought this was good, that the civilians were getting out of the way before the fighting started. But then the ground troops landed and began moving through the hamlet, and Thompson's crew started seeing things that didn't make sense. They spotted wounded civilians on the outskirts of the village, people bleeding and crawling, and following standard procedure, they marked them with green smoke grenades to signal that these were non-combatants who needed medical help. They marked at least half a dozen wounded people this way. Then they flew off briefly to refuel, and when they came back, every single person they had marked was dead. Thompson flew the helicopter over the interior of the hamlet, and what they saw was devastating. Bodies were everywhere. Clusters of dead villagers lying alongside roads, in courtyards, in the open. There was still no enemy fire coming up at the helicopter, no sign of any Viet Cong, no weapons visible among the dead. Thompson radioed an urgent message to the other helicopters and the command frequency. It looks to me like there's an awful lot of unnecessary killing going on down there. Something ain't right about this. There's bodies everywhere. They soon began seeing something much worse that the US troops were doing, which we can't describe in detail here because of platform guidelines, but what was happening down there was beyond anything they could have imagined. Thompson landed near an irrigation ditch to see if anyone could still be helped. He got out and was immediately confronted by soldiers from Charlie Company's 1st Platoon, the unit that had been doing most of the killing. He asked if he could help the wounded people in the ditch. A sergeant told him the only way to help them was to put them out of their misery. Then Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader, came up to Thompson. The two had a tense exchange right there amid the carnage. Thompson demanded to know what was happening. Calley told him it was none of his business, that he was just following orders. Thompson pointed at the unarmed civilians in the ditch and said these are human beings. Calley told him to get back in his helicopter and mind his own business. Thompson snapped back that Calley hadn't heard the last of this and climbed back into the OH-23. As they lifted off, Andreotta looked down and saw soldiers firing their rifles into the mass in the ditch. Thompson was furious, but he wasn't done. Scanning the hamlet for any remaining civilians, his crew spotted a group of about 10 people at the northeast end of the village, mostly women, children, and elderly, who had taken shelter in an earthen bunker. A squad of American soldiers was advancing toward them. Thompson recognized instantly what was about to happen and decided he had to do something. He brought the helicopter down and landed it directly between the American soldiers and the Vietnamese civilians, then turned to Colburn and Andreotta and gave the order. If these bastards open up on me or these people, you open up on them. Promise me. Colburn answered without hesitation. You got it, boss. Consider it done. He swung his M60 toward the American infantrymen. Andreotta did the same on the other side. From the open doors of the helicopter, two young Americans aimed their machine guns at a squad of their own countrymen, standing about 10 or 20 meters away. Colburn later said he wasn't sure he could actually pull the trigger on fellow Americans. He was 18 years old, and these were supposed to be his allies. He kept the gun aimed low, at the ground in front of the soldiers, rather than directly at their chests, hoping there would be no accidental discharge. He locked eyes with one of the infantrymen and gave a slight wave, and the soldier hesitated and waved back uncertainly. Everyone's nerves were stretched to breaking. Colburn later said he thanked God that everybody kept their cool and nobody made any quick moves. Thompson got out of the helicopter and walked toward the platoon leader, Lieutenant Stephen Brooks. Despite the fact that Brooks technically outranked him, Thompson told him to hold his men while he got the civilians out of the bunker. Brooks responded sarcastically that they could help get them out with a hand grenade. Thompson shot back that he thought he could do better than that. Remarkably, Brooks backed down. whether because he recognized the crew was prepared to fire or because he was relieved that someone was stopping this. Either way, he held his soldiers back. Thompson walked to the bunker and coaxed out 11 terrified civilians, mostly women and children who had been hiding from the chaos. Getting them to trust him took time. These people had just watched what American soldiers were doing to everyone they knew, and now another American was asking them to come out into the open. Thompson put down his weapon and used his hands and voice to show he meant no harm. One by one, they emerged. The problem now was getting them out of the area. Thompson's small helicopter couldn't carry that many people, so he radioed the Huey gunships orbiting nearby and asked them to land and evacuate the civilians. Gunships normally never landed in combat zones to pick up civilians, but Thompson insisted, and one of the pilots agreed. It took 2 trips to fly all 11 villagers to safety. Before Thompson's crew could leave the area, Andreotta spotted movement in the irrigation ditch, the same one from earlier. The sight was horrific, but Andreotta was sure he had seen something move. He climbed down into the ditch while Thompson and Colburn stood guard with their weapons ready. After a minute of searching, Andreotta found a small child, about 5 years old, somehow still alive. Andreotta lifted the boy out of the ditch and handed him up to Colburn, who held him gently in the helicopter. They flew the child to a hospital in Quang Ngai and delivered him into the care of the staff there. That boy, later identified as Do Ba, had lost his entire family in the ditch, and he survived because of what the helicopter crew did that day. In total, Thompson's crew directly saved at least 12 lives that morning. But their intervention did something else as well. Thompson's radio calls and his repeated insistence that something was wrong eventually reached high enough in the chain of command that Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker ordered a ceasefire. The killing at My Lai stopped, and planned assaults on neighboring hamlets were cancelled. Thompson's crew didn't just save the people they personally rescued. By forcing commanders to acknowledge what was happening, they likely prevented hundreds more deaths. When Thompson landed back at base around 11 in the morning, he was shaking with rage. According to Colburn, he slammed his flight helmet down so hard it cracked and stormed into the command center demanding to report what he had seen. He told his superiors what American troops had done to unarmed civilians, that he had witnessed officers leading what was anything but a standard military operation. The Army's response was not what Thompson expected. Instead of investigating the incident, the chain of command moved to cover it up. Within days, officers created a false narrative claiming that about 20 civilians had been accidentally killed in crossfire, while over 100 Viet Cong had been killed in a fierce battle. This was a complete fabrication, but it became the official report. Even more cynically, the Army put Thompson and Colburn in for medals. But the citations were lies. Thompson received the Distinguished Flying Cross, with a citation praising him for rescuing a Vietnamese child caught in crossfire. There had been no crossfire. The only people shooting had been Americans. Thompson was so disgusted that he threw away the citation. Colburn received the Bronze Star with a similar fabricated story, and the paperwork included an eyewitness statement supposedly signed by Thompson, except Thompson had never written or signed any such thing. His signature had been forged. The medals were an attempt to rewrite history and buy the crew's silence. Thompson was told not to discuss what happened and was rotated to other missions. The official story held for over a year, but the truth eventually came out thanks in part to another soldier named Ronald Ridenour. Ridenour hadn't been at My Lai, but he heard accounts from soldiers who had been there. And in March 1969, he wrote letters to the President, the Pentagon, and members of Congress demanding an investigation. His persistence forced the Army to finally take a serious look at what happened. Then, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story publicly in November 1969, and photographs published in Life magazine shocked the world. Thompson and Colburn testified during the investigations that followed. They told the truth about what they had seen and what they had done, and unsurprisingly, some in the military viewed them as traitors for turning on their own side. One congressman said publicly that the only soldier who should be punished for My Lai was Hugh Thompson, for threatening to fire on American troops. Thompson received hate mail and death threats. Dead animals were left on his porch. He struggled with what he had witnessed, suffering from depression and turning to alcohol for a time. He felt that by speaking out, he had damaged his career and reputation, but he never regretted doing what was right. Glenn Andreotta, the crew chief who had climbed into the ditch and pulled out the child, never saw any recognition at all. 3 weeks after My Lai, on April 8, 1968, His helicopter was shot down by enemy fire during another mission. He was 20 years old. For nearly 30 years, Thompson and Colburn received no official acknowledgement for what they had done. The army treated them as an embarrassment rather than as examples of moral courage. But in 1998, exactly 30 years after the incident, the military finally did the right thing. Thompson, Colburn, and Andreotta were awarded the Soldier's Medal in a ceremony at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Andreotta's medal was presented posthumously to his family. The citation for Thompson finally told the truth. It stated that on March 16, 1968, he saved the lives of at least 10 Vietnamese civilians during the unlawful massacre of noncombatants by American forces at My Lai, that he landed his helicopter in the line of fire between the civilians and American troops, and that he was prepared to open fire on those American troops if they continued. Thompson insisted that any recognition include his crew, be done publicly, and tell the real story. He reportedly told an army officer that if they tried to give him a medal quietly in private, he would flush it down a toilet on camera. After the recognition finally came, Thompson and Colburn spent their remaining years speaking to military cadets and officers about moral courage and ethical decision-making in combat. Their story became part of the curriculum at West Point and the Naval Academy. Colburn addressed midshipmen and told them bluntly that combat is chaotic and primal, and that their job as officers would be to keep the rage and bloodlust of their men in check. He pointed out that not everyone at My Lai had participated, maybe only a third of the soldiers, but nobody except Thompson's crew had tried to stop it. That, he said, was why leadership and integrity mattered. The boy they pulled from the ditch, Do Ba, grew up and was reunited with Colburn in 2001. Some of the women rescued from the bunker met Thompson and Colburn 30 years later to thank them in person. Colburn later learned that 2 young soldiers in Iraq had faced a tense situation with civilians and held their fire because they remembered the story of those old guys from Vietnam and what they had been taught at Annapolis. When Colburn heard that, he said it made everything he had been through worthwhile. Hugh Thompson died of cancer in January 2006, and Larry Colburn was at his bedside. After Thompson was gone, Colburn founded the Hugh Thompson Foundation to ensure the story and its lessons would not be forgotten. He continued speaking and educating until his own death from cancer in December 2016, at the age of 67. When asked why they did what they did at My Lai, both Thompson and Colburn quoted the same words from General Douglas MacArthur. "The soldier, be he friend or foe, is charged with the protection of the weak and the unarmed."